So, hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. This is our third e-talk series. I hope everybody is keeping safe and healthy. I'm Afreen Siddiqui and I'm in conversation today with Gemma O Brien. Gemma is here all the way from Sydney, Australia. Gemma is a lettering artist. She has a wonderful, wonderful creative journey, how she came to be a lettering artist and a graphic designer when she was about to pursue a career in law. I'm not going to take a lot of time, and I am going to start off with our e-talk series. So just going to... So welcome again to our COVID Design e-talk series. Let's have Gemma over here. Welcome, Gemma. Thank you so much for coming here and doing this with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Gemma, I think I'm not going to take a lot of everybody's time. Over to you, Gemma.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll just share my presentation now.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Okay. So I hope everyone can see this okay. I'm here in my...
We can't see this right now, so let's just... Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Gemma, go ahead. So,
great.
Yep,
Okay.
yep.
So, I'm here in Sydney, Australia. This is a picture of the beach nearby. I'm in my studio again, and I'm happy to be presenting from all the way over the other side of the world and being with you today. So I'm going to talk about elevating lettering to art. And essentially, this is going to be about my journey from dropping out of law school, studying design, and then ultimately my philosophy around approaching lettering, illustration, and design. And then I'm going to finish off with some tips for painting a mural, if that's something that anybody ever has a desire to do. So I will walk through those steps as well. So you might have seen my work in a variety of different publications and for a variety of different brands, including Apple, the New York Times. I've designed for bottles of champagne, toilet paper, logos, posters, and more recently, a lot of large-scale hand-painted murals. I'm just hearing some notifications there, so I'm just checking I'm all good for audio and visual. Yeah, I'm going to assume that's a yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So my background began as a child, and I was very interested in painting and drawing, you know, on paper with pens and paper, but then also along came the computer and I started playing around with digital design. This was an artwork I made for my uncle when MS Paint first came out. But despite being really drawn to these creative worlds as a kid, I ended up going to law school. And the reason for this was because I felt like there was a lot of pressure to choose a career that was smart. And I felt that pressure from my school, not so much from my parents, but that was the path that I chose. And pretty quickly I realized that law school wasn't for me. And so I dropped out after a year and a half and switched over to design. And it was in my Bachelor of Design at a university in Sydney where I discovered letterpress printing. So this was like the beginning of my love for typography and lettering. And it all began as I was an apprentice typesetter in this letterpress studio. This led to starting a blog in 2000. I think I started it in 2009. So this was a place called For the Love of Type, where I channeled my newfound passion for lettering and typography. And it was also where I could take on this persona of Mrs. Eves, which is the name of a font that I decided would be my pseudonym while I explored this world of design online. And in addition to kind of sharing things that I found in my environment, I also would fill up lots of sketchbooks with illustrations and designs in my university studies. So this is where I really started to explore and, you know, try to find ways of combining lettering and illustration together. When I finished university, I worked at a big post-production and 3D design studio called Animal Logic. They've done like Happy Feet and the Lego Movie, so you probably know maybe some of their movies. And so I was in this very digital world. I was working as a junior designer in the art department. I then worked at a similar company where it would be a lot of this kind of tech graphics from, you know, these movies where they would need a lot of, you know, I guess traditional graphic design, but in a film context. So it was a great place for me to learn new skills, but it felt misaligned with my love for like hand lettering and working with more, you know, analog tools. So after I left these big companies, I started freelancing, and I was working from my home by myself in my bedroom. This was my bedroom 5 or 6 years ago. So this is where I began my freelance career. And this was when I really started to explore the areas within lettering that I enjoyed. And the first one, the first way this came about was through a side project where I would hand draw the sick bags when I was traveling on planes. So this was like a, you know, a play on words and something that I could create as a side project, and it kind of took off online and really started to showcase my work to potential art directors, and it was called the Spew Bag Challenge. It was a bit of fun, something that combined my love of playfulness and lettering and illustration, and this was like a stepping stone to the commercial work that I started to get. So from this point forward, I liked to think about my work in terms of either writing, drawing, or painting. So writing, part of it is influenced by calligraphy, and I know obviously maybe your conception of calligraphy and my conception of calligraphy are quite different, as it's less, I guess, traditional and less taught and known. Like most people don't learn calligraphy at a young age, but so I started to really explore with different brush pens, and this led to doing logos for bands like Julia Stone, Angus and Julia Stone. I created some various expressive brush script style calligraphy and written word for Troye Sivan for his EP Wild. And also a lot of music industry work really lent itself to this like expressive, really free brushstroke work that I would then colorize and stuff digitally. So then the other side of what I started to do in my freelance work was more what I like to think of as like drawing or illustration combined with, you know, lettering as the focus. So I started to explore ways where I could add texture and pattern, depth, look for inspiration outside of, you know, the computer. And so I would collect elements and use these as the basis for drawing different letter forms and designs. And this is something actually I really love to get back into looking at this work now. I feel like it's so easy to stray into working digitally that it's nice to come back to something really physical. And what I was really interested in is how can you make lettering an artwork or make it into something in of itself? So integrating whatever illustration elements you have together with the lettering so it becomes this individual piece, rather than, I think what I felt like I learned in design school was, you know, you have your illustration or your photograph and then you've got your type and they sit separately. And I was all about bringing them together as one. And I started doing a lot of black and white, but eventually moved into playing around with color more, and then also taking this analog drawing approach into a digital space. So crisp, clean vector lines, contrasting with this more lo-fi approach. And so this is some of the drawing tools that I would use, anything from a regular pencil to an Apple Pencil, brushes in between. And I started to realize how much the tool dictated, you know, the end result. But also I think the influence of technology on the way that I worked. So as soon as the iPad came along with these digital drawing tools, I could work on the go. I was able to experiment a lot more with color. Often I would still draw my initial roughs in pencil and then digitize that using the iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil. But this really opened the doors to, you know, being able to create vector art that was not exactly the same, but in the same vein as some of the work that I was doing by hand. This was for the same toilet paper company for their Christmas packaging that came out. And yeah, this explosion of color really started to infiltrate my work after I started working digitally, because you could so quickly switch between experimentation. This is also just a bit of a step-by-step so that you can see my process with the client. This was for the Google Doodle on International Women's Day in 2019, and they asked designers to create a quote from a female from history, and mine was "Courage calls to courage everywhere." So these were the options that I gave in the first round of how the lettering could be treated. They chose this one here. And so then I move into this phase of finessing, playing around with color, adding dimension, bringing that back in, and then, you know, integrating some of these hand-drawn floral elements that I could then color. So that was the final result. And they actually had these animated on International Women's Day, and they appeared on the Google homepage, which was pretty awesome. So then the final category, I guess, when I think about where my work fits in is more painting. And I don't think it's necessarily, you know, it's not the same as fine art painting. It's not the same as sign painting. It's not the same as street art. It's almost like somewhere in between these spaces. And this came about after I was commissioned to basically hand paint 37 billboards that would be installed across Sydney for Kieran Cider when it came out. So Redfern was the suburb where I used to live. It's actually the suburb I'm in now. And these were then transferred and painted across 4 days in a big warehouse and then installed on the streets. So this was really a gateway for me to taking something from the page and working large scale. And it was also the first time I worked outside on the scissor lift. They actually had someone who had to stand on the scissor lift and operate it with me throughout the period because I didn't have my license. And you can actually see him. They wanted to not include him in the final photograph documenting the project, but you can see him lying down there in the frame as well. So this was really the beginning of working with a lot of brands on large scale murals. And I think that this came about in a time not only where I was seeking out something that was more physical, getting away from the computer, painting large scale, but it was also, there was this demand for, I guess, more content, more behind the scenes, things where you could like showcase something at an event and maybe have behind the scenes along the way. So you know, brands were not only getting that final product, but they were getting this process that went along with it. So for the past 5 years, a lot of the work has been, this is for Outside Lands and Music Festival with Lizzo in San Francisco. So we painted a mural inspired by her song lyrics, working with Twitter and Adidas for more events or, you know, large scale spaces that want that interactivity as well. And then this almost led back into my own personal work, which exists more in an experimental gallery space as well. So this piece was commissioned for the Museum of Design in Atlanta. And while this happened 3 years ago, this particular style actually came back around in the last few months as we started to embrace the COVID-19 world. And a number of artists were commissioned to create billboards for Times Square. And this became the inspiration for the style of the artwork that I would do for this campaign to thank the essential workers who were working through the pandemic. So I guess it was really a really fast turnaround, and it was just a great way, I think, for me to realize how much you have a body of work, or even if you're studying, you have particular styles and approaches of doing things, and you never know when they might come back up and you'll need to kind of revisit that for a big project. So this is the artwork sitting in Times Square earlier this year. And so then I guess the final, you know, component of this painting aspect of my practice leads outside of the commercial design world and into my own personal gallery work. And this, I think, was always something that I wanted to be part of my practice. I think deep down, maybe I secretly wanted to study art even more than I wanted to study design after I dropped out of law school. And so despite being very happy that I chose this more commercially viable career, I think I've always wanted to find a way to reintegrate the artist in my practice. And so I think one of the things that working on these more gallery style shows offers is the ability to push the boundaries, maybe create things that are a little bit less commercial, things where you have a longer timeline to conceive and come up with ideas. And so these are some pieces that I created in gallery spaces over the past 5 years and really started to hone, you know, exploration of space and styles and, you know, elevating lettering to this level where it becomes the artwork in itself. This piece is probably one of my favorites in terms of like the process and the outcome, and is like the thing that I keep on coming back to, especially now when we've got this time to reassess, I think, you know, where our practice is going. I want to see, you know, how far can I push this level of detail on a large scale, and hopefully in the studio where I am now, be able to start to work towards something similar. So the final part of this formal part of my presentation, before I let you ask me any questions that you like about anything I've talked about, is I just thought it might be helpful. A lot of people are asking about, you know, how do you start if you want to work big, or maybe you study graphic design and you've always wanted to paint something large scale, but you don't know where to start. So this is just 10 tips that I've picked up along the way, mainly through trial and error. I definitely didn't have anyone showing me the ropes, so it's really just something that you pick up as you go. So the first one is get inspired. And, you know, I think the inspiration phase of any creative practice should be the most fun, at least at the beginning, and then it gets more fun when you get to paint. But it is fun because, you know, often when you see something that you love, it's like, wow, I want to create something like that. And so for me, it was going to my first Yayoi Kusama exhibition and also seeing the work of artists like Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer, who work with really large scale typography. And I like the idea of combining these in some way. And I think the immersive nature of this scale was something that really appealed to me. So getting inspired is about like collecting the things that you like and kind of having them in your back pocket and being like, what is it about this that I like, and how can I bring that into my work in my own unique way? The second tip is start wherever you are with what you have. And I think this is especially important now while we're all in lockdown all around the world with different skills and different desires of what we want to do and create, is that you can be creative with whatever you have right in front of you. And for me, a lot of that initially was just like a pencil and a paper. And, you know, it's a great place to start. You can really come up with, you can hone ideas with whatever you have. Maybe that's something different. Maybe you're really skilled in using pen and ink or a particular brush, or you have a background in calligraphy. So what have you already got to work with and build on? And I think that's a good place to start. And so the actual first mural, one of the earlier ones I did, was not with paint, but it was with a lot of Sharpie pens, because that was at the art residency where I was, the only supplies that were there. So my first large scale work was with very small markers. The third tip is draw and design first. So I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed by the large scale nature of painting a wall. But the reality is a wall is just a big piece of paper. And so if you can, you know, really hone your design, small scale, and plan it out, then it will be less intimidating when you get to the space. So often when I go and do a site visit where I look at what I'm working with, I'll have a quick sketch and do the measurements, and then use that to really explore what the artwork's going to look like before I get there and start painting, which of course, you know, looks very spontaneous, but often has a lot of background and lead up till you get to that point. And so you can see here, this was a piece that I worked on a couple of years ago. The artwork that I created before I got there looks very similar to the final piece. And it's about like building up this library of elements, like flowers or whatever it is you want to incorporate. So if you have to come up with a design quite quickly, you can integrate them into it. And this is also, I guess, a bit more of the prep that shows, again, the sketch that was done on the iPad, and then the final piece they're painting it. This was in Sweden. And also like all the paint swatches, matching those up with what you've drawn. Often there's not the exact same color. You're not going to get the same effect from a screen as you will on the wall. So it's about just matching by eye and getting that as close as possible. And that's just another example of showing, this one was actually a vinyl print. So I didn't hand paint this, but I guess the principle is still the same of like getting that design locked down. If it doesn't look good on paper, it's not going to look good on the wall. The fourth tip is play to the strengths of the space. And I think this applies, you know, if you're working on a website or if you're working on a magazine, like each of those different mediums has its own strengths and weaknesses. So if you're working with the magazine, you've got the spread and you want to work across a 2-page spread, so you're going to play to the, you know, proportions of landscape, rather than if you're designing for the iPhone or if you're designing for, you know, Android digital spaces, you're going to work with those, you know, tools that you're working to. And when you get into a physical space, that expands to not only the dimensions, but also light and how close can people stand, furniture. In this instance, this was for Google in San Francisco, and they had this kind of teal colored couch. And so I thought, well, that has to complement the design because it's fixed there. So you're making everything really cohesive and work nicely together. The fifth tip is let your style dictate the tools. A lot of people, I think, you know, some people say to me, why don't you use spray paint, or when you work large scale, do this and do that. And I think that everybody's own style has a different look and feel, and that is shaped by the tools. But it also, when you're transferring to a large scale piece, you should choose the tools that are going to work effectively for that. So I love crisp lines. I love solid matte fills. And so the brushes and the paint that I use correspond to those specifically. The tools that I love, the paintbrushes that I love to use are called Neef, N-E-E-F. I actually think these are exclusive to Australia, but I really like them because they're very, they have like give, so you can, you know, they're not really loose, so you can get a lot of resistance from the wall, but also the paint will be held by the brush. And in terms of paint, I have one black paint that I love to use, which is the brand Jo Sonia. But then other than that, I use interior house paint, and often we'll do a lot of tests. And if I'm arriving in a new town to do that, I will allow enough time to test the paint, look at the sheens. Often like a low, like an eggshell or a matte works best. And sometimes you have to do a few different coats, so that's a good thing to account for. The sixth tip is to come prepared. And I think this probably applies a bit more when maybe you have your skill and you start to scale that up. So for me, you know, I used to just paint murals because I loved them and I would do them, you know, locally and in my studio. But then it became a thing where, you know, I would need a team of assistants to work with. I would be planning flights and accommodation. You've got to work out access with scaffolding and scheduling. So it becomes a real production. Often I might need a producer to help me with that, but you know, there's a lot that you can do as an artist or a designer in any field to be as prepared as possible. So when you arrive in the space, you're just ready to paint. In this instance, this was a job for Tiffany & Co. in Shanghai. It was a month of a lot of stress. It was a very tight turnaround, big walls in a stairwell that had to be painted. So there was a lot of preparation with getting the dimensions exactly right, because once we got there and started painting, there was no going back. And luckily it all paid off and worked out. Tip number 7 is there's no right way to transfer your design to the wall. And I think this is a big one. You know, people always ask, how do you go from the page to the wall, and how does it look exactly the same? For me, I use 2 techniques. One is using a pounce pattern, which is that red pen I'm holding there, and it basically makes this tiny perforation in the artwork that's printed at 100% that you can then take into the space and transfer like with charcoal, almost like a miniature stencil. It's very time consuming before you get to the space, but then when you get there, you're ready to go. The second option I sometimes use is a digital projector, and this one I feel like is really fast, but it requires, you know, you can't just project it and then you're ready to go. You've still got to measure, you've still got to, you know, finesse the design. It's pixelated, so it's just a bit of a tool to help scale it up and save some of that time. A lot of people use different techniques, grids. These are the 2 that just work best for me. And number 8 is continually refine your approach. When I started to work a lot more with color, I realized that, you know, I could do my pencil sketch and I would be able to work with some of the colors of the paint that I would use on the iPad and quickly indicate which areas needed to be in those colors without having to finish the whole piece, because you get the sense of what it looks like and then you let it play out on the wall, and there's that little bit of spontaneity in it as well, which is great. Number 9, I feel like, is probably the most important, and it's enjoy the process. And that's because the painting part is so much fun, and that if you've done everything leading up to this and you're prepared and you're ready to go, and then it really becomes quite therapeutic in a way that I don't think I experience when I work on digital design on a computer. You can get into a flow state. Often you're working with the team, you can talk. And, you know, if whatever it is that you're doing in design or creative industries, if you're not having fun, then find a way to make it fun, because how you spend your days is going to, you know, dictate how you feel. So, you know, it really should be fun. And this is definitely a key thing that I think I even myself have to remember, because it can get pretty stressful. And so then the final tip for painting a mural is keep dreaming big. And, you know, obviously, I think that physical scale, for me, working at a large scale wasn't just about, you know, doing this because clients want to do it, but also because I just had a desire to work, you know, on these really large scale pieces. And it's almost like you're rising to the occasion, metaphorically and physically as well. And yeah, I think there's just a great sense of satisfaction that comes with setting your mind to something and then really achieving that. And I think that can apply for anything, but for me, murals was like something to conquer. And now I feel like I'm excited to see what that next thing is, and I hope that you are as well. And so that's it from me. So I'm happy now to, yeah, take any questions about any part of the process or anything at all. So yeah.
That was lovely, Gemma. Thank you so much. This was amazing. So I think before I start off with the questions, there's one thing that I want to ask you is that, how did you jump from being a graduate from law school? So how did you get to be a designer and an artist? How did you take that jump?
Yeah, it's funny. I can't remember what it was that made me make the leap. I know that I felt like, I guess, unhappy in law. Like I was still getting good grades in the course at university, but something felt like it just wasn't right, and I couldn't imagine doing it for the rest of my life. So I remember one day I came home and I looked on the computer. I was like, I didn't even know what the options were. So I think I Googled graphic design course, you know, near me or whatever. And so at the time I was still growing up in Brisbane, and something came up, and I think I just made the switch. Just one day I decided, okay, I'm going to do it. And I think by that point, because I was out of school and my parents were pretty supportive, that I didn't have that pressure from the university, from my school, to stay with law. And so, yeah, I think it was a good move. And I think also that, you know, now when I talk to a lot of young people, my younger brother's just in university now, he's 21 and he's doing engineering and law, but also loves music. And I think there's a misconception that you can't make a career or you can't make money out of creative fields. And while I think you know, I can understand that fear, that ultimately, you know, creativity is going to have a huge role to play in the future, and it's really important. And I think that there will always be a need for it. So if that's what you want to do, then go for it.
So so it's difficult to get an opportunity like that. So what opportunity did you get to that helps you take this jump?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, I always had a feeling of a safety net with study, that like, because I knew I could work hard, and, you know, I thought no matter what, I'll do that. And even if, you know, when I switched over from working full time to freelancing, even at that point, there was a bit of, you know, fear around, you know, being able to get clients and that sort of thing. And I had a side gig where I would sell flowers at the markets to make extra money while I was doing that. But I think that the big break came for me out of my university degree when I got an internship at Animal Logic, and so that was like a stepping stone into that world as well, which was great.
Okay. So I want to hear more about Mrs. Eves. Could you tell us more about Mrs. Eves?
Yeah, sure. So do you know the font Baskerville?
Yes.
Yeah. So have you ever heard the story of Mrs. Eves?
Yeah, I have, but I just want the audience to listen to it as well. So
yeah, of course. So when I started studying typography, and it had this really rich history, and I, started to learn that all fonts kind of came back from this printing period back in the 18th, 19th century. And I came across the story around Mrs. Eves. So basically Mrs. Eves, Sarah Eves, was the housewife for John Baskerville, who was designing and printing types at the time. And the rumor is that when his wife passed away, they fell in love, and she continued to print a lot of his designs after he then died. And so, in the folklore of typography, was considered one of the first women in typography. That story then got picked up in the 90s, and Emigre designed a font called Mrs. Eves in honor of this story. So I saw this, came across this story, and thought that's a cool name to take on myself. And so I used that on my blog, which then continued onto my Instagram and to this day. But a lot of people outside the design world who follow me on Instagram are like, why are you Mrs. Eves when your name's Gemma O Brien? So yeah, it's a nice little connection to the beginning.
And one more question, but just elaborate a little bit what you do when you go on an airplane with the bags, paper bags.
Yeah, so the spew bag challenge, it was basically, I made the rules were that I had to think of a pun relating to being sick, and I would draw it on the blank sick bag while I was on the flight. So if it was a short flight, it would be a quick one, longer flight, more detailed, and then I would leave it in the seat for the next person to find. And this started to take off when I was traveling a lot more, and it was, yeah, it kind of, I had an exhibition then of all the framed sick bags, which sold out completely. And there's actually one that says nausea in the NASA logo, which I think someone from NASA was asking me if they could buy it recently, which was awesome. But I mean, never know. Now, air travel it's off the cards for a while, so maybe they'll become more of a rare item.
Definitely. They were really interesting to look at. I hope that, do you have them right now somewhere that we can share that with the students?
Actually, physically have none. They've all were sold in the exhibition. But if you go to spewbagchallenge.tumblr.com, which is so old school, I can add that link for you at the end if you need. There's all the ones that I created. And then on Instagram, on the hashtag spewbagchallenge, I encouraged other people to also do the same thing. So there's people all around the world who've also created their own. But it's been a very long time since I've done one. It's probably about 5 years. So yeah.
Okay, so I'll come to the technical questions now. So how do you feel the introduction of iPad affected your practice? Is it close to, because it's so close, the traditional medium, but then you have the restriction of layers and transition to print? Yes,
it's a very good question. And it's actually something that right now I've been thinking about a lot, because I'm in my studio a lot more, not traveling. And so I had resisted setting up a really big, analog to digital process in my practice, because I was always traveling. So the iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil had a big impact, because not only did it allow me to, digitize faster, not have to take my scanner when I traveled, but yeah, it was really mobile. But there was limitations as well. So the pros, I think for me, were able to explore color more, able to translate my designs digitally faster. But I think the cons were physically, working at a small scale in this one, with calligraphy or with painting, you're using your whole body and moving your arm. And I never got any kind of, pain when I was working. But then working on the iPad, it was in the same kind of same shape and same movements, and so I got a lot more tension in like the process of creating. So, and I think also limitations in terms of layers and stuff at the beginning when it first came out. I think now obviously there's Procreate and there's actual Photoshop you can get on the iPad, so there's a bit more flexibility, but I'm in the process now of kind of reassessing my practice, and I've actually just got a big giant Cintiq Pro that I'm going to start playing with soon, because I want something that's as close to the scale that I work at on paper, and unless Apple's secretly going to reveal a giant rollout screen sometime soon, I think the Cintiq Pro is the biggest one there is. I'm also going to explore, like I'm very neutral when it comes to brands. Like I want to explore and see what the pros and cons are of each before I settle into what my new practice is. So yeah.
Okay, so it did pull you away a little bit from the traditional mediums, right? Using the iPad.
Yeah, it did. And like, actually, I'll just grab for you a drawing. So like, this was how I used to draw everything on like kind of a transparent film with micron markers, and then I would scan it and color it digitally. But then a lot of the time I started to do this on the iPad. So I feel like I love the physicality of having these pieces here. And even now, just going through things in my studio, I'm like, oh, I'd love to have a combination of both. But I think it really depends on the project. For fast turnarounds, like sometimes the iPad can just be a quicker way to do it. So yeah, I kind of want to have a fluid back and forth between analog and digital.
So in your intro, you talked about visiting Pakistan. You did visit last year. We met in Islamabad. So there's a question that how did you find, what do you think about the art of lettering in Pakistan? It's calligraphy over here. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think it was awesome. I think the most that I saw was in the workshop that I did. And when I first arrived at the airport, you know how they have the artworks of I'm trying to remember what it is. Is it the truck painting?
Yes. Truck art.
Yeah. I think it's like beautiful, and especially the context of it being on a truck, that makes it even more beautiful, because I don't know if you've been to Australia, but there's nothing like that on the trucks here. It's it's the opposite of beautiful. But I love this calligraphic tradition, and I would love to learn how to, you know, write in different languages and to learn different techniques of different scripts. And yeah, that's something that really interests me. And everyone who I met in Pakistan was awesome. The only bad thing was that I was there for too short a period of time. It was like 2 days, and yeah, I just heard about how much beautiful, you know, adventures and countryside, and I saw some amazing photos of places. So yeah, hopefully in the future I can come back.
Oh, we hope that too. So there's a question from a student. So how do you able to stay motivated and focused during all your painting phase?
I think that the painting part is easiest to stay focused, because once you've done that artwork, the design and the sketch and the pencil outlines are on the wall, it's very clear, like beginning to end. Like you get a sense of satisfaction each day. You see a little bit more is done, and you know that inspires you to do more. Whereas sometimes when I'm in the studio working on client projects, you get lots of feedback and you're going back and forth, and it's sometimes hard to get that momentum. But I think that when you're painting, it's a very clear beginning and end, and that really helps to stay motivated. So
why the love for type? Your earlier works did not restrain you to just playing around with text. So what made you make the jump to this side?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny because I don't know if it was a conscious decision, but there was definitely something that I was drawn to. And I think when I look at it now, it's because it seemed to me when I first discovered typography that it was like this secret world of like design, where you walk down the street and just the way that letters are chosen or written or printed like tells a story, and it tells a story about a place and a time and a tradition and a culture. all just within like these common elements of characters or letter forms treated in a particular way. So I think that aspect of how it was so linked to like the human experience or a particular moment in time, I found that really interesting, and I continue to find that interesting. And sometimes I think I have to remind myself of why I was so drawn to it, because yeah, I think it's easy to forget. Like, it's been 10 years, over 10 years now since I started doing it. And so, you know, it's always good to remind yourself what it is that sparks your interest in the first place.
So on that note, how did you go large scale commercially? Often people have ideas of what they would like to do, but for most illustration students entering into the industry, they get bound down by the needs of the industry.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, you know, when I was in university, I had never painted anything large scale. I often worked large scale. Like, if I did an illustration, I would get the biggest piece of paper at the art store. Like, I would go as big as I possibly could. And I think you're also limited by what you have access to. So if you're in a small space, and when I was in university, I had a tiny little flat that I was living in, you don't have the possibilities to do that. But I think it's like a stepping stone of a little bit bigger or a little bit pushing yourself that you want to do. And I think also showing, like, as soon as I started showing, okay, I do painting or I do murals, then the clients would ask me to do that. So it's about like putting stuff out there that you want to do more of. And, you know, I think sometimes that designers and artists and creatives like have a good idea about what might be, you know, successful or what might connect with an audience. So if you're feeling like something's really cool, just put it out there and then see what happens.
So how did you make the industry accept this side rather than being eaten up by the demands of the industry? How did you make them accept this side?
I think it takes time. And I think it's also like you win some and you lose some. Like, when I think about my work, there's lots of client work that I don't share because for whatever reason along the path, it isn't the kind of thing that I want to work more on. Even though it might be a good project, it just might not be the kind of work I want to create. So out of every 10 projects, there might be one that I love. And, you know, I think sometimes you can push back in a commercial context and say, I think this will work. Other times it's just the way it goes and it doesn't turn out how you wish. So I think that you've always got to balance like the demands of the industry or what you think is popular with what you actually like, and find somewhere in between.
Okay, so what was your first large-scale project? So what was your first large-scale project?
So there were two that were significant. The very first large-scale one, which I didn't have any pictures of in my presentation, was in an art gallery over in Western Australia. And it was the first time I did an exhibition. It was the first time I was asked to do an exhibition. And basically I had a 2-week art residence, and they said at the end, you can present and show whatever you make. So I went over there not knowing what I was going to do, but they had a gigantic open empty room, and I thought, and they had a projector. And so I did drawings on paper and I projected them and painted them. And that was the very first time that I painted large scale. And it was so cool. Like, I loved the process. I loved just the scale of it. And from that point forward, I knew that this was something I wanted to continue with. And then the project where I was commissioned to paint those billboards came shortly afterwards. So those two things was really the beginning. Yeah.
When you're doing large scale projects, so do you have a process or step-by-step map in your mind how you're going to go about it?
Yeah, so often if it's for a client, it will follow the same steps as any commercial commission, where they'll give me a brief, I'll do a series of sketches, there might be feedback, this is all happening, you know, on paper or digitally, and then I will go to the place and paint it at the end. And the steps, I guess they're pretty clear now, just because I've learned them along the way, where, you know, you get the design, I'll go to the space, project or pounce pattern, and then paint over a number of days. So that's the commercial way. And then if I'm doing something in a gallery, it can sometimes be quite different, when no one will have seen the design beforehand. and I will just get into the room and like lock myself in for a week, and basically, you know, I'll still design it first, but it'll change a bit more because you have the ability to change it as you go. And that's what I hope to do a bit more of maybe in this lockdown period in my space that I'm in now, because I've got these big white walls and I'm actually here. So it'll be great to push and experiment a little more.
So how do you create your color palettes for murals to deliver a certain feel?
Yeah, color is actually a very interesting one for the way that I paint murals, because it's kind of inspired by my illustration style, which is quite graphic and limited. And I don't really have a lot of like, you know, realistic blends. It's very like, you know, it's almost like screen printing where you might be only able to use 3 or 4 colors because more than that's expensive. Well, when I paint murals, it's like the more colors there are, often the longer it'll take, because different colors require different coats or different, you know, whatever it might be. So often if it's a client project, I might say you can only have up to like 5 colors max if it needs to be done within a certain amount of time. So then I'll take my original drawing and then like separate it into be like, how can we make this still have like depth and interest in a limited color palette? And then one thing I like to do is I love, you know, when you save your inspiration, whether it's on Instagram or Pinterest, you know, I have folders where it's just color palettes, and, you know, looking at them and, you know, almost replicate. The great thing with, I feel like, with color palettes is because your style can be so different if your style isn't defined by using only 3 colors all the time. And for me, I like to shift and change between different palettes. So it's kind of nice to, you know, you can replicate a color palette and still create a completely different piece of work. So yeah, it's something that I definitely want to play around with more, and maybe even do some experiments with which have no typography or lettering as well, just pure color.
So when you're creating these murals, how do you create a spatial difference between backgrounds and upper layers in your murals?
Yeah, that's a good question. No one's ever asked me that before. I guess depth and dimension, like, were never something when I first started to explore typography, because it was always so flat, because you're studying printed word and, you know, often it was just black on white and there was that real contrast. So having this like dimensionality in 3D or illustrative dimension to it was something that I always wanted to include, because it took it outside of the world of printing and graphic design and more into this world of like illustration. So I think for me, you know, the depth can be created either through, you know, adding this dimensional drop shadows, or, you know, placing small elements on top. You can do it through color as well, with some of the darker colors in the background and the lighter colors on top. But I think it depends on the artwork entirely. Like if you're just working in a single color, like black on white, you can still have a lot of depth. And I like to play around with like the movement in the lines as well, so you can, you know, create something that looks like it's kind of coming towards you, and like that too.
So you visit a lot of places. So does your artwork get influenced by the spaces you visit, by experiencing the different thoughts of people and the ambience of foreign spaces?
Yeah, I think that I've especially thought about this recently because I haven't been traveling. So I've been looking back through photos and remembering experiences in different cities, and, you know, there is such a wealth of inspiration in when you see architecture or tiles or whatever it might be in a different space, and you kind of forget that where you are is just one way of doing things, and you go into a new city and suddenly, you know, there's a different aesthetic. And so I think I like the idea that I'm inspired by my travels, but I think there's a lot more potential for me to go back and revisit some of that inspiration and put it into my work more, because at the moment I don't think it's come out that much. So hopefully it's something a bit more in the future.
Okay, so could you suggest a book for our young designers? Can you suggest any book?
I can look at my bookshelf over there. I guess I love really visual books when I'm looking for inspiration. So anything by Stephen Heller, and he often collaborates with other authors to do like these typography books that are very visual. So they have one that's all dedicated to shadow type. What else is there? I think there's a lot of really good introductory, like if you're just getting into typography, there's a book called Just My Type that's just like a showcasing of different little snippets of stories. But yeah, there's so many good books, and I guess usually I'll write a little bit of a list for you if I can see some in my bookshelf, and you can share it with everyone afterwards.
Okay, so would you suggest any? What's your favorite type?
What's my favorite type?
Yeah.
Well, I think, when I often work with murals now, I don't create some of the sans serif typefaces myself because, I'm adding so much detail and customizing them that I want to work with something that's really solid and bold. So sometimes I might even just work with like Futura medium and then adjust so there's not as pointy elements on the M's and customize it. But it's a really good skeleton as a base to build from. And then of course Mrs. Eves, because it's my font, that's my name. What else is there? I like to use DIN for just documents and it's funny, there's so many processes where you just have to choose a typeface, and sometimes I find that really difficult because often I'm building on it and making it into an artwork that just using something really simple can be hard. But there's a really good Australian type designer called Dave Foster. He does some cool work. And then in New Zealand, do you know Klim Foundry? Klim Foundry has some really awesome
Okay.
type.
So we're going to note these names for our students because they really want to know your inspirations and some feedback on the lettering artist. And they really want to know if you can share some resources of the fonts or patterns that students can use to try lettering art.
Okay, cool.
So, okay, so the last question, something you want to do in future, any different art direction? Or do you think of anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely been thinking about it recently, and my step one is to paint this entire studio from floor to wall, 5-meter high ceilings. I want to do that in the next year. So behind the scenes, I probably won't show much of the process, but that's something I really wanted to do. And so that's my number one goal. I think beyond that, I'm not sure. Originally, I always lean towards saying things like I want to design a rocket that'll go into space or all these big things. But I don't know. I think I would be happy if I just painted every day. And at the moment I don't because I'm doing a lot of commercial work. So I think it's a small goal, but yeah, sometimes those are the good ones.
Okay, so before I just end this call, do you wanna give some advice to our students, because this is the time that they are in the exploring stage of their career, and they will be stepping out in the professional world really soon. So do you want to say something to them?
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, really enjoy your time when you're still studying and the period that you're in now, because when I think back to when I was in university, I loved it because I could be experimental. I could try lots of things. You've got these resources of amazing teachers or people that you can turn to ask for questions. So really make the most of that period while you can, because I think that when you get into the real world, some of the initial spark of why you chose the area that you're in gets lost in the desire for creating this work in tight deadlines. And so yeah, really enjoy the period that you have now and start to explore what you really want to do. And yeah, I think that you're in the driver's seat. Always come back to, okay, of course you have to make a living, but always keep a little bit of something that you're working on that maybe really speaks to something that you love, so that you can continue to build that on the sidelines if you need to take a more commercial project as well. And good luck.
Okay. Oh, okay. So since you talked about truck art, so do you plan to make any mural inspired by the truck art?
Ooh, well, I actually was looking at, there's a photo that I have on my Instagram from the truck art, and it popped up in one of my inspirations for a project I'm working on, and I thought, oh, I've got to revisit that. So I think I love the way that in the truck art, there's lots of borders and lots of levels of detail, and there's text integrated really into the illustration, and I love that. So yeah, hopefully, I wouldn't want to make it too derivative. I want to make it my own, but it definitely would be inspired by it. So I'll keep you posted.
Okay, that sounds interesting. So I think that's about it. We are going to end now, and we just want to give a shout out thanks to you for doing this for us today, and thank you for showing your work. Thank you for sharing your journey with us and with the students. And they really enjoyed it because there were a lot of questions that were the students have been asking, and I've been trying to, incorporate every question to right now.
Awesome.
But yes, so before I go, I just wanted to give a shout out to a thank you to our dean. She came today and she's been listening to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Samra, for being here. And before I end, I would request our head of the department, Ms. Aisha Imdad, if she would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Afreen. Wow, Gemma, it was an amazing talk. I just loved the entire journey that you had of your creativity, how it developed, how you started out as a lawyer and then you became a designer, and then and then on top of that, you decided that you wanted to be you wanted to be a designer with the art of lettering as your field. That was amazing. And then now you just pushed your boundaries and turned that into an art form. You didn't let the commercial work to hinder your way. You turned it into a beautiful, expressive art form in which I saw some of your work. People were interacting with your work. Your work has reached new levels, which is amazing. I hope that our students can learn and get inspired from the way you're working. And I truly believe that your passion actually pushed you to reach all these new levels of creativity which you achieved in your work. It's amazing. I just love the journey which you have reached in your work. Now I just thank you once again for your amazing talk, and I hope that our students are inspired, and some of them use this as an inspiration in their work and try to do something amazing like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Such kind
Thank
words.
you. Thank you so much, Aisha. So I'm going to end this call. I just want to give a shout out to my technical team, Ms. Amna Hashmi and Zara Hafiz, and two of our volunteer students who helped us in the design, Mr. Shahroz and Mr. Osama. And with that, and I'm your host, Afreen. So with that, I'm just going to say once again, thank you, Gemma, for being here. And I'm going to end the call. So before I go, just a heads up for our next talk. Our next talk is going to be on 22nd of this month, and it's going to be with Tom Cito. So he is a guru for animation. So I hope to see everybody over there and to gain from Mr. Cito in our next talk. So that's about it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Gemma. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
So bye-bye and Allah Hafiz, everyone. So Aisha, Amna, you guys are here.